Good morning. In our previous couple of lessons, we introduced Matthew and Mark, focusing especially on how can we confirm the Christian traditions that Matthew and Mark wrote those Gospels. Because the Gospels don't start out saying, this is the Gospel of Mark or whatever, it just starts right in. And none of the Gospels say up front, as we have said, who the author is. And in ancient times, when everything was written on a scroll until they started using parchments, and then they started making something like a book. But before that, they had scrolls, and you would write on the outside of the scroll what this is, so that in a library was a shelf full of scrolls. You could see, without undoing the scroll, you could see what it was from the outside, but it wasn't part of, the title wasn't part of the body of it. And so over time, as they made copies, all they had was the innards. You didn't have the name. But we have all of the Christian testimony from early years, how they referred to these Gospels. And that's called external evidence. Anything from outside the Bible that tells us anything about the authorship of a book is the external evidence. Internal evidence is looking inside the Bible and finding out, is there anything that would point us towards an author? With Matthew, we saw the internal evidence, for example, that it was written by someone like a tax collector, someone who had details of taxes and coins and money very prominently in the book. And there was internal evidence because we saw that the Gospel of Matthew is the only one that has the story of Matthew being at his tax collecting booth and having Jesus come and call him, for example. In Mark, we saw the evidence that Mark faithfully recorded the gospel preaching of Peter. Mark was not an apostle, he was not an eyewitness. But Peter preached in Rome, and the earliest Christian traditions, going back into the earliest part of the 2nd century, discussed Mark doing this. And the internal evidence from the Gospel of Mark is this is a gospel of preaching to the Gentiles, not to Jews. And there are various differences, therefore, between Mark and other Gospels that you can see. What's the external evidence? Well, usually there's not a whole lot of external evidence for Gospels besides the fact that Christian sources all refer to this as the Gospel of Luke. There's no argument in early Christian sources. There's no competing theories that they eventually settled on Luke. It was always just referred to as the Gospel of Luke. And there's just no controversy about it. And of course, Roman historians, for example, don't write about things like this. Roman historians don't care, to put it bluntly, about our books. From the viewpoint of the Romans, they had an empire full of people of different religions, and as long as there's no religious conflict, they're happy, and they don't really learn all the details of all those religions around the Roman Empire, and they don't settle religious disputes. And that's why Pontius Pilate, for example, was frustrated that these Jews were bringing their dispute to him. This man said such and such about the temple. Pontius Pilate's thinking, how is that my problem? Go settle that. So they had to turn it into, this man says he's a king. He rivals Caesar. You got to make the Romans care about it. And so that's the direction they had to go. But the Romans don't get involved. Roman historians aren't going to write about who wrote these Gospels. So the external evidence is all in one direction. It's all in favor of it being written by Luke. But all that external evidence comes from Christian writings. So what about internal evidence? Well, it's hard to talk about the internal evidence concerning the Gospel of Luke without also looking a little bit at the book of Acts that Luke wrote, because those two books begin the same way. They're obviously written by the same author, and Greek scholars can see that, and the book of Acts begins by referring to that earlier book that he wrote, so on. So there's a relationship here. Acts, the first 4 verses of Acts reference that earlier work. And the Greek style, the Greek vocabulary show that these two are a unified work from the same author. There's also a lot of Gentile and Samaritan themes in the Gospel of Luke that indicate it was probably written by a Gentile author. And Luke was a Gentile. The parable of the Good Samaritan, for example, is only found in Luke. You can get an idea of a gospel author by looking at what he includes that other gospel authors didn't include. Out of all the stories that Jesus told, and all the teachings, all the miracles, and so on, why would certain things stick in Matthew's mind? Well, when they had to do with money, for example, and taxes, and paying taxes to the Romans or not, those stuck in Matthew's mind. And there are stories in Matthew that are only in Matthew that we looked at that relate to those topics. And there are stories that relate to Gentiles and Samaritans and so on that would stick in Luke's mind as being important. And they show up often only in Luke. In the book of Acts, we find at a certain point, instead of speaking in the third person, Paul did this, Paul and Barnabas went here, Paul and Silas went there, suddenly it says we. And that's how we know when Luke would have gotten involved here. Now, after Paul had seen the vision, that's the vision of the so-called Macedonian call. He saw a vision of a man in Macedonia saying, "Come to us." They were across the water in modern-day Turkey. Macedonia is Greece. And so they determined, we sought to go to Macedonia. That's the first we verse in the book of Acts. So the author of the book of Acts has joined the mission, has joined the missionary journey here. And the we language happens multiple times in the rest of Acts. The author joined in Philippi, Greece. He joined in Greece. He writes fluent Greek. He writes it as his first language. One of the things Greek scholars notice about a lot of the gospel writing is that it seems to be the kind of Greek that you would use if Aramaic, which is similar to Hebrew, were your first language and Greek were your second language. There's all kinds of things that are not really the way Greeks thought and worded things that are more like Aramaic, but they're in Greek. The Greek scholars call them Hebraisms. And you don't see that in Luke, except when he's reporting the words of Jesus that were spoken in Aramaic. But Luke writes like a Gentile who has Greek as his first language. He writes very good Greek, and that fits all the other evidence. Now, the author of Acts, who doesn't name himself in Acts, stays with Paul all the way to the end. At the end, Paul is under house arrest. And at the end of Acts chapter 28, it says he's permitted his own home. People are coming to visit him. He's still teaching people the gospel. Even the guards around him, he's teaching the gospel to. And the we language continues. So The author of Acts is there right through the end. Then, it would seem, from what we know of history, Paul got released from that house arrest. And he continued his work for a little while. But then came a persecution under the Emperor Nero. And then he was arrested and imprisoned and executed in Rome. Now, the book of Acts ends before that. When he was imprisoned for that second and final time, he wrote what are called the prison epistles. Colossians and Philemon and 2 Timothy, for example. And in three of those, when Paul gets to those concluding remarks at the end of each letter, give my greetings to so-and-so, greetings from so-and-so to you, he's here with me and he sends his greetings to, and so on. Luke is mentioned explicitly by Paul as still being with him at the end here when he's in prison. In Colossians 4:14, we have the statement that Luke is a physician in Paul's closing remarks. That Luke is a physician, and that matches the education level that we see in the Greek. So once again, all the pieces of evidence are lining up. This was written by a very educated Gentile. And so that bit of evidence matches. Luke is a Gentile name. It's another piece of evidence. So the Christian tradition that this gospel was written by Luke matches all the evidence. And nothing else really does. I mean, that's basically the argument that Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, because the only evidence we have, internal and external, all points in the same direction. Now, when did he write? Well, you've got this 2-volume work, Luke and Acts. And so you can date the end of Acts because there's a lot of references to different Roman rulers that we can go off to Roman historical sources and peg them at certain dates. Not just emperors, but city officials and cities they went to that Luke names. And we have inscriptions and so on that we've uncovered. So we can date the end of the book of Acts when he's under house arrest. That's right at AD 62. So the book of Acts doesn't have any material going beyond AD 62. And there's an interesting statement at the end of Acts 24. Paul was saved from the mob in Jerusalem and taken over to the coast, and he gave his testimony before Felix, the Roman official there. It says in verse 27, after 2 years had passed. So he's over there in house arrest for his own safety. For 2 years, Felix received a successor, Porcius Festus, and because he wished to do a favor for the Jews, Felix left Paul in prison. This is the logical point at which Luke had 2 years to go do research, because Luke didn't witness the gospel events. And he didn't witness the first half of the book of Acts either. So he needs to be talking to Paul, but also to other apostles and other witnesses. And he's got 2 years to do it. He's stuck in the Holy Land. He's stuck in Israel for 2 years, waiting for this outcome. And so that would be another time to pin down. When did he do his research? When did he write? He did his research from about 59 to 61 AD. Early Christian Irenaeus said Luke wrote after Matthew and Mark, so the early Christians were already aware of which books were written first and which books were written later. And as I mentioned, he was released and then later imprisoned. Now, if you think about it, it would be awfully strange for Luke to bring the book of Acts to an end with Paul sitting there under house arrest. If Luke already knew about Paul being martyred, and Paul being martyred is kind of a big deal, and you don't leave something like that out if you already know about it. So if Luke had written much later, it just kind of defies all logic that Luke would say, well, I just won't mention that. I mean, it's a major event in Christian history that Paul was martyred by Nero. So it would seem that during that house arrest, Luke finished writing his books. And since the book of Acts references the Gospel of Luke that he's already written, it seems that he finished writing the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts by AD 62. So it seems like he had 2 years to go interview people while Paul was before Felix. Who did he interview? Well, you can get internal evidence of that by seeing all of the stories that Luke has and who did they come from. One of the first things you notice in the first 2 chapters is there's a lot of information that sounds like it came from Mary, the mother of Jesus. Mary treasured up these things in her heart, thought about them for later. What does it mean that these wise men came and said this? What does it mean that the shepherds came in from the field, and said they had seen a vision or whatever? She had all this information. John the Baptist's mother, Elizabeth, was her cousin. There's a story there of Mary visiting Elizabeth. Elizabeth was much older than Mary. Elizabeth has probably passed away by 60 AD. But Mary was young at that time. She would still be alive, and she would be able to provide interviews to Luke and provide all this information that Luke has that we don't find elsewhere. Another thing is that Luke names names. He gives a lot of names in his gospel. Why would he name names so much? Well, because he wasn't a witness. He's interviewing eyewitnesses. And so he's tipping us off as to who these witnesses were. In Acts chapter 13, there are names given. It reads, "In the local church at Antioch, there were prophets and teachers. Barnabas," we know Barnabas. "Simeon, who was called Niger," don't know him from anywhere else. "Lucius the Cyrenian," don't know him. "Manaen, a close friend of Herod the Tetrarch," don't know him from any other verse. And Saul, before he became known as Paul. So other than Barnabas and Paul here, who are these other people? Why are they mentioned? Well, I think they're mentioned because Luke spent time in Antioch later with Paul, and Luke interviewed these people along with Paul and Barnabas, and he's giving their names because they meant something to Luke. They don't mean anything to the rest of the story. They're never mentioned again. Remember the famous story, there's the road to Emmaus. After the resurrection, there are 2 disciples traveling along the road to Emmaus, and Jesus appears to them but doesn't permit them to recognize him. One of them's named Cleopas. The other one, no name. Why do you think that is? Why give the name of one of them and not the other? Well, He might not have, by the time Luke did interviews, the second person might no longer have been a follower, or might not have been, or he could have been, for that matter, he could have been dead. I mean, it seems to me that Cleopas probably got interviewed by Luke. So Luke names the eyewitness that he's getting his info from. And if he doesn't interview the second one, he doesn't name him. And there's a variety of reasons that he might not interview the second one. He might not be a follower anymore. He might be dead. Might have moved off to some, might not be accessible to Luke. There's possibilities there. But Cleopas is named. The likely story behind this being in the Gospel of Luke is that Luke interviewed Cleopas. And in fact, there's a Clopas, if you get rid of the E, there's a Clopas mentioned in Jerusalem. Mary, wife of Clopas, was one of the women witnessing the crucifixion. And then there are ancient Christian documents indicating that there was a leader in the Jerusalem church named Clopas. And Clopas is a very rare name. So it could be that Clopas or Cleopas was still a prominent member of the Jerusalem church in 60 AD when Luke was interviewing, and so he was very accessible to be interviewed. Luke names the women who financially supported Jesus' ministry at the beginning of Luke chapter 8. Soon afterwards, he was traveling from one town and village to another, preaching and telling the good news of the kingdom of God. The 12 were with him, and also some women who had been healed of evil spirits and sicknesses. Mary, called Magdalene, 7 demons had come out of her. Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's steward. Susanna, and many others who were supporting them from their possessions. So once again, just like Cleopas is named and the other guy isn't named, we have specific names, and then we have and many others. I think the distinction is that the ones that are named specifically were interviewed by Luke. And the ones who are covered by and there were many others are ones that he didn't interview, didn't have any access to. The famous story of Zacchaeus appears only in Luke. The little man who climbed up in the sycamore tree, the tax collector who repented at Jericho. Why does it only appear in Luke, and why is he named when so many people in Gospels aren't named? It's just a man whose son was sick and so on. There's no names in lots of stories in the Gospels. Why is he named? Well, perhaps he was still a follower. Perhaps he was accessible to, say, the Jerusalem church at the time that Luke did his interviews. Luke gets the story directly from him. So let's take a look at an outline of Luke here and look at how it does and does not parallel the Gospel of Mark. You start out with the first 2 chapters. You've got the birth of John the Baptist, the birth of Jesus, the genealogy of Jesus, and none of that is in the Gospel of Mark. And when we talked about the Gospel of Mark, we said none of that really matters to Gentiles so much as it matters to Jews. Jews want to know the genealogy and birth story of Jesus, because if you are inheriting the promises given to the Messiah has to be descended from King David, and you've got to prove that you're descended from King David, and so on. So there's no parallel. But then we have a lengthy section in Luke, these next 7 chapters, where there's strong parallel to the Gospel of Mark, because this is the heart of it. This is the Galilean ministry of Jesus. And so it very much parallels Mark. It pretty much follows the outline in Mark for that section. But then, and this is something I didn't realize until fairly recently, there's a section, a long section in Luke that doesn't have any indicators of time or place. It's what we refer to as a sayings collection. It was common for students of a teacher to collect together the sayings of their teacher. And we have that for numerous ancient teachers, from Confucius to Greco-Roman teachers and whatever. And a sayings collection doesn't really give you much indication. When did he say that? Where did he say that? What events came in between sayings? It's just saying. It would seem that when Luke was interviewing people, when people said, I remember one time Jesus taught this parable, Luke writes it down. But if that person can't remember exactly when and where, Luke wasn't there, Luke's going to be careful. He's not going to make something up. He's not going to say it was at a certain time or place. And so Luke throws it all into this section. There's a very lengthy section here that goes at least to the middle of chapter 18, maybe the end, depending on which scholar you read, where there are almost no parallels to the Gospel of Mark. Luke didn't get this from the Gospel of Mark. Luke got this from his interviews. But Luke doesn't necessarily know when and where each of these things were. And so Luke groups them together, sometimes topically. So, for example, you'll have the parable of the lost coin and the parable of the lost sheep immediately after it, and the parable of the prodigal son, the lost son, all grouped together in Luke. But we need to be careful and realize that does not imply that Jesus rattled these off one after another. That's a topical arrangement. They might have been consecutive, they might not have been. We'll get to that later. Then we get to Jesus makes his final journey to Jerusalem. He gets crucified and resurrected and so on. Now we're back to being parallel to Mark. So what Luke did was he realized these sayings that he doesn't know exactly when and where to place them, they sound like they're part of the Galilean ministry of Jesus. So when he has finished following Mark's outline of the Galilean ministry, he takes all those sayings and puts them now, because obviously they're not all in the final weeks of Jesus' life in Jerusalem, and that's where we're headed. So this is where they go. This is where they belong. As I just said, so Luke is a very careful writer. We see this all through the book of Acts. Luke gives lots of details and they check out. And if we had time to really look at this in the book of Acts, we would see some amazing things where Luke says so-and-so held a certain title. He was a certain city official in some city. And we know from archaeology, from digging up inscriptions, that that title was unusual and that this person only held that title in that city for 2 years, and then it was changed, and after that they got a governor and they don't have that title anymore, and so on. And Luke has it pegged down, and it can be confirmed, yes, that was an unusual title. It only existed for a very brief period of time. It matches up to the journey of Paul. So Luke was there. Luke wasn't somebody writing something down 20 years later. This is eyewitness testimony, and Luke is extremely accurate in mundane details even. So Luke is not the kind of person who's going to take some saying of Jesus and say, I'll just claim that he said that right after the feeding of the 5,000 or something. Luke isn't going to do that. He doesn't write that way. But once again, in this saying sections, we don't have time and place. And so we have to watch out whenever our English translations sometimes use a word like then, which would seem to imply, Jesus said such and such. Then Jesus said something else. What does that mean to you in English? Does that mean definitely one came first, then the other one came second? The problem is that word then is being concocted by translators. And when you look at examples, you see that it's really just a Greek word that means and. Now in English, we don't like to start 10 sentences in a row with the word and. And I did this, and then I went there, and then and, that's not good English style to constantly start every sentence with and. But it was fine in both Hebrew and Greek. And so this gives Bible translators a question: what should I do with this? What should I do with this word when I come across it all the time? Luke 17:1 starts out, then he said to the disciples, in some translations. Does that mean it came right after what he just finished saying in Luke 16? But it's in the King James and New King James, it's translated then, but lots of translations translate it literally as simply and. So if you say, Jesus said, and you have a parable, and Jesus said to his disciples, there's no chronology implied. And this becomes important when somebody digs out chronology from one of the other Gospels. And one of the other Gospels definitely says this was taught first, and then this second thing was taught immediately afterward. And then you come to Luke, and it's in a different order. Is that a contradiction? Well, it's not a contradiction if one gospel says here's the definite order and the other gospel doesn't say anything about order. It just says here's some sayings. But when a translator uses a word like then, it can mislead us. And then you dig around in your cross-references, you go to the other gospel, and it says, oh, wait. Some translations say, we don't start sentences with and all the time in English. We'll just leave it out. We'll just drop that word. We won't say and or then or anything else. So the problem there is that what's about to be said in Luke 17 is much earlier in time in Matthew and Mark. It's early in Jesus' ministry, and Matthew and Mark are pretty definite about the chronology here. But Luke is not putting that saying at any particular time. There's no contradiction. So we'll pick up with Luke. I think it'll take probably, to do Luke and John, which are pretty complicated, probably take 3 weeks for 2 Gospels. But we'll pick up again next week there. Thank you. So Sunday, August the 14th, I'd be ready for you to take over, I think, if you want to. All right. Thank you. Hey.